One of the great epics of survival and rescue of all times involved the British explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton. Now we're in training to recreate just one small part of what Shackleton himself described as the last great journey on Earth.
It was a drama that stretched over 2 years back in the depths of the First World War. In a bid to be the first to ever cross the Antarctic, Shackleton's ship, the Endurance, was trapped by sea ice and later crushed and sunk. Frozen and hungry, his crew rowed their lifeboats to remote and desolate Elephant Island. Then this lifeboat, the James Caird, was sailed by Shackleton and 5 men out into atrocious weather to try and alert a rescue party.
It was possibly the greatest open boat journey of all times. More than 2 weeks in hellish conditions across the wildest waters in the world. And yet when they reached the safety of South Georgia, they were on the wrong side. The rescue that was promised by the whaling stations was still across a treacherous snow-covered mountain range.
Exhausted and shivering, Shackleton tackled that final obstacle with resolute conviction. A crossing and a challenge that we're going to try to repeat. It's all taking place on the sub-Antarctic island of South Georgia, an island of phenomenal beauty that's been likened to a slice of the Alps stuck straight into the ocean. And crowding its snow-covered length, some of the densest concentrations of wildlife found anywhere in the world. This then is our mission, to follow in the footsteps of Sir Ernest Shackleton and to experience the stunning scenery and abundant wildlife of an island that sits at the end of the world. Our modern-day journey begins at the tip of South America. Stately, snow-clad peaks towering over us as we head down the Beagle Channel, en route to the wild open waters of the Southern Ocean. From the Tierra del Fuego, we'll sail east to the Falkland Islands, then spend several more days travelling to the incredibly remote island of South Georgia. Our Russian icebreaker, the Polar Pioneer, is under charter to Aurora Expeditions, headed by a mountaineer of formidable experience, Greg Mortimer, a veteran of more than 80 trips around the Antarctic.
We're sailing to South Georgia, and that's where Shackleton started his famous endurance epic. And 2 years later, that's where he ended it as well, by walking across the island. And it's one of the great feats. It's the holy grail of modern exploration.
Among those attempting this feat, Tony Wheeler, founder of the Lonely Planet guidebooks.
The whole story of the Endurance and being stuck in the ice and spat out the other end and the boat journey and everything else is intriguing.
We're joined as well by a real-life Shackleton. Brenda has married a distant relative of the famous explorer and has been in hard training for this crossing for the past 2 years.
My family says I'm mad, and I think they could be right. Right, no, it's just that I heard so much about Shackleton that I thought it'd be nice to give it a go.
Heading further east into open waters, the Polar Pioneer begins to pitch and roll.
Well, these are wild, wild waters, wildest in the world, and yet we're travelling in the relative comfort of this modern Russian icebreaker. Just imagine how rough it must have been for Shackleton and his men in those 15 days sailing from Elephant Island to South Georgia, frozen stiff in conditions far more atrocious than this.
Up on the flying bridge, the winds are strong enough to give our tents a trial. In all, 15 of us will attempt to cross South Georgia, and it's imperative that all of our equipment be tested in the harshest of conditions.
There's a really good mix of experiences from all over the world, and we're just putting them all together now by doing this, getting a fist of each other's skills.
Our transport to shore also needs a workout. At the first signs of a small island off the Falkland Islands, inflatable boats are tested. Getting ashore will be much tougher in the big swells of the Antarctic, and the art of reaching the beach relatively dry has yet to be mastered by some of the crew. Creatures that have mastered the art of a graceful entrance are the Gentoo penguins. As if to welcome us ashore, hundreds of Gentoos turn the waters alive as they return from their daily fishing swims. Some 70,000 breeding pairs can be found here around the Falkland Islands, where they'll usually march inland, single file, back to their nests. It's here we watch their nesting rituals, the endless collection and depositing of stones. All around them, giant elephant seals watch on. By far the biggest seal, the males are longer than the average car, with the Shackleton expedition depending on these creatures to survive.
Elephant seals, of course, are what sustained Shackleton and his men on Elephant Island. The meat to eat and the blubber to fuel their stoves.
Seals and penguins in abundance. It's all a taste of even greater wildlife sightings ahead of us on South Georgia. Next morning, the Union Jack is unfurled as we sail into a very controversial English settlement. We've arrived in Stanley, the capital of the Falkland Islands, with our guide here, the museum manager, Leona Roberts.
Hello, Greg. Welcome to the Falklands.
Thank you.
As you can see, the gorse is out in full bloom despite the lack of sunshine. We've only got 2,500 people on the islands, but there's plenty to show you, so let's go and have a look around.
Some 2/3 of the Falklands population lives in Stanley, a collection of English pubs and houses, and an archway that demonstrates the size of the blue whales that once swam these waters in their hundreds.
This is an arch made of the jawbones of blue whales. It was presented to the colony on its centenary in 1933.
Despite all the signs of a long English settlement, the Argentinians still refer to these islands as the Malvinas, with abundant signs of their invasion just over 20 years ago. Many beaches are still closed by landmines. Exotic signposts testify to the presence of British soldiers. And monuments pay tribute to Britain's war heroes.
This is the Liberation Monument. It was erected in memory of the 255 British servicemen and women who died to liberate the islands from Argentine occupation in 1982.
But the one English hero still fondly remembered at Government House here is Sir Ernest Shackleton. He slept in a room now named after him as he mounted his rescue operations for the men left behind on Elephant Island.
He complained, or was alleged to have complained, that he was colder in this room than he ever was in South Georgia or Antarctica, so it was pretty drafty by all accounts.
Back on the Polar Pioneer, our long haul down to South Georgia is bringing with it our first real taste of the Antarctic. The decks glisten white with our first fall of snow, while the temperature plunges noticeably as we sail out of the relatively warmer waters of the Atlantic into the freezing currents that surround the Antarctic.
We've entered true Antarctic waters. We've crossed out of the Southern Ocean into the Antarctic convergence. It's just starting to snow lightly. The temperature's just above zero, and I can see an iceberg straight ahead here.
It's a real thrill to see a first iceberg of the trip. Solid evidence that we're entering a new world. And as the day progresses, they get bigger and bigger.
Freezing out here. This is the first big tabular icebergs we've seen, and you know, this is a monster, a couple of miles long, and I think it's sitting in water 160 metres deep, sitting on the bottom.
Grounded.
Yeah, and we're out in open ocean.
Icebergs were just one hazard that faced Shackleton on his trip across these waters. Antarctic historian Tim Bowden reminds us that Shackleton faced far greater challenges.
But in that 7-metre little lifeboat with 6 guys in it, they had 10 days of gale out of the 16 that they made this 1,300-kilometre dash to South Georgia.
Our own time sailing to South Georgia is spent learning the ropes. The crossing is known to be heavily crevassed, meaning we'll have to be roped together.
We're just going through the mechanisms of getting everyone onto a rope. We all come from different, schools of thought, and we're getting the same language between us. And we want to get that right now before we get in amongst crevasses.
One of our climb leaders is Don McFadzean.
Goes round the back. It's one of these things you train a lot for, and you drop people in crevasses, and you do the extraction exercise.
Difficult job to do if there's only one of them.
And Brenda Shackleton has roped up for her own crossing challenge.
I've done it before.
Yeah, and how have you gone before?
Fine, it was in the Himalayas going up Merah Peak, and it was okay.
Okay, and how are you feeling now about this climb?
Once I get started, I'll be all right. I'm still a bit nervous, but just hoping for the best.
Early next morning, well before the sun has risen, the Polar Pioneer's radar shows a huge obstacle up ahead. What we've encountered is an iceberg so large it's blocking our path. As we emerge into daylight proper, we begin to take stock of what we've encountered. It's an iceberg larger than a big city. For much of the day we'll sail its length, mindful that this has been tracked by satellite since it broke off from the Weddell Sea. Certainly it's worth a closer look.
What an awesome slab of Antarctic has broken off right here. Hundreds of thousands of years in the making. Scientists say it'll be at least another 15 years before it breaks up completely.
Greg takes us right alongside where we're dwarfed by the sheer ice walls. It's close enough to touch. In fact, just a bit too close, as the waves almost crush us under an overhang. And then it's Peter Rushworth's 15 seconds of fame as he clambers onto a smaller bird for the photograph of a lifetime. One more day's sailing brings us in sight of a spellbinding vision. Here at last is South Georgia, the island at the end of the world.
Well, this is precisely the South Georgia that Shackleton would have first witnessed. These dramatic snow-clad mountains rising abruptly out of the sea, shrouded in cloud, and the big question, where to land?
The coastline is ever so treacherous, so much so that Shackleton spent a day finding a safe place to come ashore. We'll explore that refuge shortly, but first we sail alongside the island to get a sense of its majesty. Here is an oasis of an island, the gateway to the Antarctic for many explorers, amongst them Shackleton, who first sailed in from England at the end of 1914 at the start of his ill-fated mission. His destination then was the whaling station at Grainger, an ideal target for our first landing as well. As we sail into a deep inlet known as Cumberland Bay, the mountains squeeze in around us. And there on shore, a memorial cross to Shackleton. As a whaling station, it's been closed for more than 40 years, with only a handful of people now living here. Among them, a most remarkable couple, Tim and Pauline Carr. They sailed here on a small yacht 10 years ago and fell so much in love with the place, they've stayed on to manage the museum.
Life on South Georgia is brilliant. It is the most special place we've ever been to in 30 odd years of cruising around the world. South Georgia's got a combination of special things. The wildlife is the immediate thing that you see on the beaches, and the greatest concentration of Antarctic, subantarctic wildlife on the planet. That is a huge plus. But then you look beyond that and you see the mountains. They are so beautiful, they change moods all the time. We're able to go into them and camp up there, dig snow holes and survive.
And one of the first great adventures ever to take place here was done by the great explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton.
And Shackleton's journey still to us is one of the most amazing, well, it has to be the most amazing journey ever made. And the more familiar you become with the conditions and the savage weather here, you realise he was incredibly lucky, but he also had incredibly good judgment.
Grytviken today is both an inspiring and very sad place. Rusting whaleboats and factories are reminders that the whaling stations of South Georgia were responsible for the slaughter of almost 200,000 whales. In all of our time around South Georgia, we saw not one whale. But there are plenty of other reasons to be attracted to South Georgia these days. Tim Carr has had plenty of time alone on South Georgia with Pauline to ponder the advantages.
It is remote, and that's what makes it special, I think. It has this moat of the Southern Ocean around it, 800 miles from the nearest small town of Stanley, and gateway to the Antarctic, and it just has this incredible aura of adventure and excitement and history that all wrapped up is anything that I could ever want. The sort of solitude and loneliness in winters here is another story where you have the whole island completely covered with snow. We've never found ourselves in that situation before. Snow down to sea level at 1.5 to 2 meters deep, being able to step out of the boat and go several days up into the mountains.
Tim, it is awesome scenically, these mountains just rising abruptly straight out of the sea here. I mean, that's spectacular in its own way.
Many of them are unclimbed. You've got to go a long way to find those nowadays, so that in itself is exciting. Every time one goes on some sort of a trip here, you feel that you can be treading in somewhere where somebody hasn't been before.
Grytviken was home to 300 workers in its heyday, their village overlooked by this 90-year-old whalers' church. It's been superbly restored by Tim and Pauline.
We've been very fortunate enough to stop it from collapsing. It was leaning very much to one side.
One feature here is the bell tower.
We're allowed to ring these out?
Yes, certainly. These are two big bronze cast bells, and you can see they're different sizes to give the different tones, and very heavy, so ring them reasonably gently.
The first pastor here admitted that the religious life of the whalers left a lot to be desired.
They actually hold services here, don't they?
In fact, one of the church's most common uses was for funerals. Shackleton's service was held right here. The great explorer has been honoured in the church with a room full of tributes and plaques left by passing ships.
To us, he's obviously a hero figure, and we think of him and talk about him a lot, especially when we're out there in the hills and saying, wow, how on earth did he cope with this sort of stuff? He will be strong in our minds for as long as we live, that's for sure.
Tim has been so inspired by Shackleton that he joined the first team to ever successfully follow the explorer's route over the island. So will we be successful?
We've got snow, driving snow, that can stop a party. I wish you luck. It hasn't been a good summer up to now. The weather looks really iffy at the moment.
Before tackling the crossing of South Georgia, our plan is to experience some of its wildlife firsthand. The beaches are packed with all manner of creatures, from fur seals to reindeer from the Arctic. The Norwegian whalers introduced the first of these for sport and food, and now some 2,000 run free. It's the penguins, of course, that are prolific. The most spectacular are the king penguins, with those brilliant orange gold coloured feathers around their neck and upper chest. There are so many of them that one needs to walk ever so cautiously to get from one end of the beach to the other. Then there are the macaroni penguins, the most abundant species on South Georgia. It may be a relatively small island, but it's still home to some 5 million of these birds, identified instantly by their colourful head feathers. Far less common are the chinstrap penguins, with that trademark black line running under their head. At this time of the year, early summer, the chinstraps are busy collecting rocks for their nests. Once built, their partners incubate 2 eggs. So fearless are the creatures of South Georgia that you never need to walk to them. They'll willingly come to you. Just sit on the beach and baby elephant seals scramble all over you. These pups are only a couple of weeks old, but within a month they'll be heading out to sea. All around us, elephant seals of all ages are engaged in their daily rituals, from the newborn pups suckling their mother's teats to juveniles drawing blood in their first combat. And watching over all of this, the beach master. This massive bull guards up to 70 cows, and he'll have nothing to do with other bulls. This intruder tries his luck with a young pup, but the beach master will tolerate no such thing. He may weigh some 3 tons, but he's still capable of a good speed as he chases off the prowler, before settling down to some affectionate moments of his own. And then there are the casualties. Young pups squashed by marauding bulls and left to the giant petrels to feast on. One of the greatest wildlife spectacles on South Georgia is watching the magnificent wandering albatrosses in flight. These graceful wanderers have the longest wingspan of any bird in the world. Today a real treat. This is Albatross Island. Guess what? There's wandering albatross, some 150 pairs of them on this island. Getting ashore to see them though is going to be just a little tricky, I'm told. Our obstacle is going to be getting past the fur seals on shore. These are very aggressive animals, known to inflict painful bites. They're in an even more agitated state right now because their pups are being born. Some of these pups are only hours old and the entire beach has become a nursery. Armed with a ski stock just in case they charge, we make our way up into the tundra to find the albatross. First one we find is a juvenile. This one would have hatched at the onset of winter, remained in the nest until this time, and now, at 9 months old, is preparing to make its first flight. A few flaps, and there's liftoff. Brief at first, but once it's matured, it'll go to sea for as long as 5 years, never once touching land in all that time. They're very slow breeders, and thus nest building is an important chore. Females don't lay their first egg until they're 8 years old and then rear a sole chick every other year. Sadly, their numbers are declining as many birds drown after swallowing baits set by longline fishermen. Imagine the mixed emotions then as we watch them take off, launching themselves into a headwind for a trip from which they may never return. One final wildlife experience before we set off to cross South Georgia. A huge colony of king penguins on the island's far northwest coast. As far as the eye can see, the kings stand shoulder to shoulder. More than 80,000 of them, almost half all the king penguins on South Georgia.
How impressive is this, the giant king penguin rookery here at Salisbury Plains, by far the largest on South Georgia. And right here, the nursery, tens of thousands of young, fluffy brown chicks guarded by a few adults while most of their parents are out to sea fishing.
They've huddled together for warmth right through the winter. Their thick brown fur making them look like woolly penguins. In fact, their new coat is so thick that chicks look bigger than their parents. But then their downy uniform starts shedding, resulting in some most unusual appearances. The mohawk look is in fashion here, this chick taking to the water for the very first time. The youngsters of other species are stepping out for their first encounters too. This fur seal pup a bit bewildered by all those penguins. That is, until he finds a place to play by himself at the water's edge. Surrounding him, the mass movements of tens of thousands of kings, marching out to sea to catch a meal, mainly small lanternfish. It's an arduous search ahead of them. Scientists have tracked them travelling hundreds of kilometres, where they'll dive several hundred metres in search of fish. And within weeks, they'll all be back to moult into a new set of feathers and lay eggs for next year's crop of chicks. There's a tremendous sense of exhilaration and trepidation as the polar pioneer noses cautiously into King Haakon Bay on the rugged southern coast of South Georgia.
This is kind of like it would have been, Shackleton would have seen it, in fact. It's quite formidable. The cloud base is about 1,000 metres and there's a lot of snow around.
Shackleton's first refuge, after an horrendous 2 weeks sailing from Elephant Island, was a tiny inlet he called Cave Cove. Taking to the inflatables, we motor into the same minute bay. I'm filled with awe just entering this historic spot. And there, right there on the left, is the cave they first sheltered in.
Firm land at last for Shackleton and his men after 16 days at sea. The small cave to shelter them from the snow and rain outside, a small stream to provide water, and just above us on these tussock-filled hills, some albatross chicks to at last provide sustenance.
A self-confessed Shackleton buff, historian Tim Bowden is thrilled to be here.
It's just so magic to be in the very spot that they came ashore in that little cockle shell. And those flat rocks there, Shackleton writes in his diary that he had to stand on them for 2 hours, fending off the James Caird with no feeling in his feet at all. And then they came ashore and drank deeply of the stream just over there.
Today, the same watercourse is almost frozen over. But what a relief it must have provided for the Shackleton crew. Their drinking water had been badly tainted by salt water, and this was their first fresh supplies for days. And their first substantial meal, well, that was waiting for them just up that gully, guarded today by fur seals. At the top, petrels nest these days, but 80 years ago there were plenty of albatrosses and their chicks, providing the Shackleton survivors with a real feast. We're heading right up to the end of King Haakon Bay. This is where the James Caird was sailed to allow Shackleton to begin his famous crossing. As we prepare our modern high-tech clothing and equipment on shore, we're mindful that Shackleton and his two fittest men set off wearing the same wet, freezing garments they'd worn for months.
It's grim, it's quite grim. These are tough things, these are tough conditions to start walking in.
Oh, it's looking intimidating. The weather's a bit blowy and it's a bit cold, but I'm sure it'll probably only get worse.
I'm ready to go. Just want to get going.
It's cold.
It's not too bad.
Snowing.
Snowing?
Hellish.
Yes, a little, yeah. But we'll do it, won't we?
And with that upbeat spirit, we set off. But remember this crucial difference. Should we fail to make it, we can retreat to our ship. For Shackleton to turn back would have spelled doom for all of his crew, those here and those back on Elephant Island. Like Shackleton, the first part of our crossing takes us up a gradual incline towards the centre of South Georgia. Where the explorer and his men marched without tents or sleeping bags, we're well provisioned, so much so that 2 of our team of 15 had to haul sleds laden with supplies. And again, our team is outfitted with the latest snowshoes and skis, in comparison to Shackleton's boots that were fitted with screws from the James Caird. One thing that was in Shackleton's favour was the weather. It was relatively mild, whereas we're confronted by strong winds from the outset.
-2. Windy as hell.
After 2 hours, we take our first break at the top of a pass that's been named Shackleton Gap. Conditions are worsening and there are crevasses ahead.
So I'm going to head sort of over there and then back around onto the Murray snowfield. But we need to keep together now, much more. And it's likely we're going to have to rope up soonish anyway.
Just in case any of us fall into a crevasse, we're roped into 3 teams. The next stage of our crossing is taking us across a plateau. But what lies ahead? There's so much snow falling, there are no mountains or features of any kind to be seen.
These are just white-out conditions. Just can't see a thing ahead of us.
With every step, the winds gather force until we're in a full-scale blizzard. Where Shackleton marched for 36 hours non-stop to reach the other side, it's becoming clear we'll need to camp before dark. Hope the storm abates by morning. Our plan is to reach a set of mountain peaks known as the Tridents, and there at last we begin to make them out.
I've been walking for some 6 hours now. We're right alongside the Tridents. Greg would like to well below these for a bit more protection to camp this evening.
But within minutes of that, with light fading fast and the blizzard beating us mercilessly, the order was given to break out the tents. And what an exercise that becomes. Holding the canvas steady and inserting tent poles becomes a team effort. Our fingers are freezing, the winds are lashing us hard, and it's just so much harder and slower for all of us to get just one of these tents up. For extra protection, we dig blocks of ice to build a barrier in front of the tents. And then we're ordered inside. It's vital to keep our body temperatures up. To make drinking water, snow is melted in the same slow, tedious way as the early explorers, with the order given to drink as much hot tea as possible.
We've got 4 of us in a 2-man tent. I'm the only one that doesn't smell bad. And it's going to be hell. Tonight will be hell.
So it's a small tent, as you can hear. Snow pouring down outside, ferocious wind, tent flapping around.
What follows is a bitterly cold night, rewarded by breakfast, a slice of pudding, and the realisation that this deteriorating weather means we might not be able to follow all of Shackleton's trail.
How serious a situation do you think we're in?
We're in very serious situation. Our options are to keep going along towards Stromness the long way, but we've got the wind behind us, or turn around and face into the wind and escape out in Possession Bay. And either is a pretty tough prospect.
Over in Brenda Shackleton's tent, it's been a long, sleepless night.
Wild night, Greg. Very wild. I was warm though, except for when the snow was falling on my face.
I think South Georgia's throwing up all the wind that we thought was possible. It was a pretty horrendous night.
So much snow has fallen during the night, it's almost blocked the entrance to our tent. The conditions are truly appalling, and Greg's first satellite phone call back to the ship signals that we're in for a change of direction.
I think there's a very good chance we might go back down to Possession Bay.
The trek out follows a bitterly disappointing decision. We're still going to cross South Georgia, but are now taking a shorter route across the island into Possession Bay. Ahead of us now, another formidable challenge, getting down a steep mountainside.
Well, I'd slide all the way down on my bottom, just as Shackleton and Crean and Horsley did. But at the bottom of this particular slide is a glacier, and that spells certain death.
The safe way down this almost vertical drop is to lower ourselves by rope. As we descend, I'm mindful of the fact that had Shackleton chosen this shorter route, he would have found a whaling station open near the bottom. As it was, he thought the station was closed and opted to travel a much more difficult diagonal route across South Georgia. Even this shorter crossing is not without difficulties. Our sleds continually topple over. Foremost in Leader Mortimer's mind has been to keep our team alive, even if it's meant aborting our planned route.
I'm kind of disappointed in a way, but not with the decision. Just a shame we didn't get some better conditions.
These have just been horrendous.
Yeah, it has been.
And as we've said many times before, if Shackleton met these conditions, he just may not have made it.
Yeah. I mean, we're almost down to sea level now and it's blowing like stink.
Right.
Still, it's still very cold.
Cold enough to step up the pace as soon as the grading eases. Greg demonstrates his skiing skills. While I'm happy just to run downhill. And at the base of the mountain, after another long day's travelling, the tents are broken out once more. We're now right on the shores of beautiful Possession Bay, made famous by Captain James Cook, who named South Georgia after King George III and claimed it for England. For all of us, there's a growing admiration for Shackleton's successful crossing, and mixed emotions about our own efforts.
Things like this, if they didn't fail sometimes, they wouldn't be worth doing, would they?
Very, very disappointing. You live with that for our dogs, yeah.
When you look back up at it, look at it. You did it.
Big, it's quite a big drop.
Yes, it's a big drop. I think I've moved on from it.
For us, rescue is now close at hand.
I'd like you to come directly from Cooper Bay to Possession Bay to pick us up, okay?
And there we wait, until the Polar Pioneer finally emerges through the mist to collect us. We've sailed down the coast to Fortuna Bay, where we intend to march the last part of Shackleton's famous crossing. Once he'd climbed across the island, he still had to walk along the beach at Fortuna Bay. Then clamber over one last mountain. As we trekked the last steps to what for Shackleton and men was the safety of the Stromness whaling station, there's time for us to think long and hard about the crossing. Had Shackleton had the same atrocious weather as us, would he have made it? Or would he have perished? Many think he would not have survived. As it was, he crossed the island without resting, marching non-stop for 36 hours. It was indeed a phenomenal effort. And then the sight that would have quickened the explorers' hearts. Can you imagine how Shackleton felt when he reached this point? Safety at last, the strongest whaling station in sight.
Really excited. As I said, when I got to the top and I looked down and I just saw, it was a magic moment.
Our team is so elated, we celebrate by launching ourselves down the mountain the quickest way possible.
Out of control.
Ahead now, the rusting remains of the old whaling station. All that remains is to walk along its beach through a myriad of very territorial fur seals. At the far end, the manager's cottage, where Shackleton made his first contact with outsiders since he left South Georgia almost 18 months before.
And it was into this room, the manager's office, that the three explorers were ushered to meet the manager. "Do you know me?" said Shackleton. "You're the mate of the Daisy," said the manager. Shackleton responded, "My name is Shackleton," to which the manager is said to have wept. Afterwards, those very tired and cold explorers were ushered upstairs, where awaited a very welcoming warm bath. Well, such was the grime and grit these three men had accumulated in their months without bathing. It's said that they left a very discernible black rim around this bath.
All that remains around the manager's cottage these days are sheds, devoid of all the whalers that once worked here, and instead full of slumbering elephant seals. Our final moments on South Georgia are spent remembering the man who'd inspired us to come here. Sir Ernest Shackleton is buried in the small cemetery at Grytviken, with Brenda Shackleton leading some of the climbers in a simple ceremony to pay tribute to her distant relative. Such was Shackleton's dedication as an explorer that he'd returned to South Georgia 6 years after seeking rescue here, only to die of a heart attack on his new expedition vessel in the bay off Grytviken. Brenda Shackleton's tribute today is a deeply personal one. Knowing how much Sir Ernest thought of his expedition friend Tom Crean, she's carried a stone from Crean's grave in Ireland to place here on Shackleton's grave. A moving tribute to a true hero of the Antarctic.